Good evening and welcome to Inside the Rookery Season 7, Episode 10, where I'm talking to Andy Law about planning role-playing game sessions. Welcome to the stream, Andy. Welcome to everyone who's joined us, because I think you were pre-streaming, and everyone who has jumped over from your previous Lawhammer stream on where you were answering questions about all the Warhammer gods. So, hello.
I'd also just like to briefly say sorry for quitting out of that stream so fast. I just dived out to get over here.
So, is there anything you'd like to talk about planning the game before I start bringing up questions? Because as always, I have loads of questions pre-submitted by patrons, and people who are in the chat are very welcome to pop questions in for me too, and I will bring them up on screen. Like this. I suspect Andy is starting to develop an addiction to be on live streams.
Just jumping from stream to stream to stream like some sort of squig hopper. Right, so yes, I do have a couple of things to say about planning your RPG sessions before we go. This is a topic that I have a lot of opinions on, so be prepared. They're about to hit your ears very soon. I have both opinions on how much planning you should do, but also on how much you shouldn't do. I have opinions on which sessions will benefit most from it, but also sessions that will actually be hindered by planning. And that planning could not just be a waste of your time, it could actually make the session that you're about to play somewhat less interesting, or worse, frustrating. Because sometimes sessions can be very frustrating for a GM if they had expectations of things happening that are not met. This is particularly the case for some new GMs who have this great master plan of the story they'd like to tell, and they find out that the players are telling a completely different one, and they're left going, is that what I want? So yes, planning is, for me, a core part of that whole process, and exactly how much should and shouldn't be done. So very much looking forward to this one.
Excellent. Let us just start with a question from Martin. And Martin's given me quite kindly, some context in a different paragraph, so it didn't max out my comments. So I'll bring up the context afterwards. Martin asks, do you think it's useful to read through published content as a prospective player first? For context, on my first read through, I'm imagining myself as a player. It helps to ground me in the content and think about what's important.
Yeah. So, do I think it's useful? Yes, particularly if it's a setting that's different to a setting that you have previously experienced. However, there are many players out there that don't engage with reading particularly well. They just don't enjoy doing that part. They'd much rather understand a game through playing it. And I'll go to a different analogy to ground that in nice and clearly. There's nothing like boring someone completely with a new board game than spending half an hour before you start playing trying to describe every rule, particularly for more complicated games. Often it's better to just get stuck in and play, and through the course of playing it and seeing the mechanics in practice, you start going, that's how I play that board game. Gotcha. All that chat that you had going previously confused me, but now I get it. And you'll find that for some players, that's definitely the case with role-playing games as well. Do you want to say something there?
I would just like to say, in board game etiquette, if you adopt that approach and you've explained the rules in brief and then you're really playing the game to help people understand the rules, then please don't try to win. Please explain to players what they could do better and why you made the move they did. And if they made it like a silly move that, like in Quirkle, right? Quirkle's the simplest board game in the world. I'm going to get it, so I've got a prop.
Well, while she's getting a prop, I'm going to say right now, oh, this is perfectly timed, you can pre-order your own copy of Dark Deeds. I can't believe I've used that to shill.
If you played Quirkle, like if you have tiles in your Quirkle hand, you can put them down at the end of other tiles and get 2 points, or you can put them down underneath 2 sets of other tiles and get 4 points. It's really fucking rude if you're playing it with someone not to tell them that that's the better way to get points the first time you play it with them. And that board game etiquette is a hill I will absolutely die on.
And in some respects, when it moves over towards this, the simplest of questions here, which is basically, should players read the game they're about to play? The answer is no.
No, sorry. That's not what Martin's asking, though. Martin is asking, is as a GM, should he read it as though he's a prospective player?
I misheard it when you said it. And the answer is damn straight, Martin, and good idea, because it really does help you understand what they're about to go through as a player. And indeed, if I've got a system that I find particularly onerous to get to grips with, I'll often, as a player, roll up some characters, figure out how it all works, and actually get to terms with it. And go back to our board game analogy. If I'm getting a new board game for the first time, I'll often play it with myself before I try and teach someone else, because teaching it with other people can often be a horrendous experience for everyone concerned, meaning that a great game sometimes won't land and will sit on your shelf for a while, where if you just played it a couple of times yourself and then played it out with the others, knowing how it all works, it works much better. And yes, since we're speaking about board games, if you don't know, we've got our own board game, Dark Deeds. I am going to bring up the good old board game every time that I can. For more details, go check our website, rookerypublications.com. If you want to know where you can pre-order it right now, which you can do so, go check down in the info for this video, sitting inside the description just down below on YouTube. If you're on Twitch, seriously, come over to YouTube and get the link over here, because that's quick.
So there's a good question in the chat, which I think would be good to cover early on in the stream. So Total Warrior says, this topic could not have come at a better time. Well, actually, it's not a question, but whatever. I just bought Wifrit 4th edition and I'm trying to learn how to GM from my wife and I. So I will ask the question on Total Warrior's behalf. What, like, as a first timer, like, what are the nuts and bolts, like the absolute must do's and don't do's as a GM?
Okay, so I don't want to answer the whole core GM part, because it's a stream about prepping for what you're doing, but there are certain things you can do as a GM to make the game experience as open and as welcoming as possible for a new player. And that is, don't teach the rules first. That can massively intimidate unless your game is super simple and requires just, for example, 2d6 plus 1, 2, or 3. That's it. That's all your rules. You're done. That's cool. If you're doing Warhammer, for example, the concept of you roll 2 dice, 2 10-sided dice to create a percentile number, and you're rolling a number or lower to pass or over to fail, that's fine to teach. But the overall rest of it, don't worry too much about that at all.
Hammond says you're still live on Lawhammer.
I am? Oh, well, let me just say we're on both sides. I did not quit out that stream, apparently. So the only way for me to... Oh, that's awesome. We're dual streaming. Hi, all. I'll get rid of that video after. I don't want to quit out and then go back in. We can just be on both sides. I'm still live over at Warhammer. That's brilliant. I can maybe switch that video off. But that is a really interesting... Hi, over there in Warhammer. We're dual streaming. That wasn't the plan. That's not supposed to have happened. It was meant to shut down, and it didn't. So we're on both sides, whatever. That means we're streaming out to, what, 6 channels just now? 7 channels? Brilliant. So, hey, we're on that side too. So I'll just leave it up for the moment. I'll get rid of it afterwards, because it won't hurt at all. That's actually cool. So to say in this one, what you need to worry about more is about what the core tone of that setting is, telling the stories that are there, and then allowing a few dice rolls to start modifying how that tale is told. Once you've got those in place, your session, which should be planned, will introduce some core concepts of that setting. So say, for example, you're playing Warhammer. Combat is quite common. So getting a combat in your first session is good, but you really limit it down. It's a very simple combat. First sessions need to be simple. Let that one go. Let them get to grips with how that all works so they're not intimidated. Then move on to another one. Then you drip feed rule after rule after rule through the course of your session. The Enemy Within, the very first adventure for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, kind of does that. The first adventure inside the starter set for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4 sort of does that too, to greater or lesser extents. But loosely speaking, what you're looking to do is drip feed rules in so that a player, particularly if they're a new player, is not intimidated and they can get to grips with each step. The tone for the setting is more important in many regards. And you'll get that by planning your session first and thinking, I'm going to do this, 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 this. And for your first few sessions, railroading, as it's often commonly described, is generally a benefit because the players are not going to be sure what to do if they're 100% new. So having the options before them be very limited, very clear, is broadly to your benefit and theirs, because they can go, I want to do A or B, rather than I can do anything, I'm lost. I don't know what to do next. I've never role played. What do I do? Instead of, your characters ask the question, do you want to go over there or do you want to go over there? Immediately, that fixed agenda gives them something to interact with. They go over there, and then if you can, plan for the consequence of seeing the choice they didn't take. So they can go, oh, my choices make a difference. Okay, so my next choice I'll be a bit more careful about. Another choice is offered, various rules are made, and slowly the system is exposed to them, the story is told to them, and the tone of the setting is made nice and clear by whatever adventure you're putting in place.
Although you're still live on Lawhammer, it's a black screen and it's muted. So
Oh, okay, that's good. I can sort that afterwards.
okay,
Oh, that does suggest
that's
I'm going to have to edit the video afterwards as well.
it does. So Seagoat suggests, this is good advice from Seagoat. As a first-time GM, do not be afraid to make mistakes. Be honest, and if you get something wrong, let folks know. If you don't know something, make a decision and move on. Look it up afterwards.
Indeed. I'm trying to answer purely from the planning stage.
Yeah.
But that is beyond good advice. Cannot recommend that enough. Thanks, Seagoat. That's a really good answer.
Elle asks, how do you approach planning a one-shot as opposed to a full campaign?
Okay, now this may come as a surprise to some folks, but I do much more planning for a one shot than I ever do for a full campaign. Because a one shot, you're telling one single story that has to land in a single session. It's got to have a beginning, it's got to have a middle, it's got to have an end. And it's all too easy when doing a one shot that the end gets lost in the morass of player choices, or because too much time was spent doing something that was either unimportant or seemed important at the time, but you'll find that in, say, your 3 or 4 hour slot, it just took up too much of it, meaning that the conclusion is rushed. And the best way to make sure that it's all lands correctly is to plan the whole session end to end, understand exactly what's offered by it, ensure that it is simple enough to be handled during the course of just a single session, and that you know it back to front. I plan my one shots way more than I plan ongoing campaigns. Ongoing campaigns, planning for that can vary massively according to the needs of the individual session. But for a one shot, I cannot express enough how much this is the one you want to actually plan. And that planning might be, if it's a one shot that is already written for the system, say, for example, you're buying an adventure online and it's designed for one session and you're playing at a convention or something, that is one where you absolutely need to have read the adventure multiple times and that you never ever have something like this. So what are you doing? You're doing that, right? Give me a moment. Okay. Right. So what's in that room? Yes, fuck that. You don't have enough time. If you don't know what's inside the next room along, you make it up on the spot. And that is where you have to have prep, not on the actual words on the page, but prep as a GM. Your ability to actually just create stuff off the spur of the moment, to just make shit up, a core GM skill, but many people are not so good at that. So the prep is your previous sessions where you have purposefully not prepped and tried to just let it go. The best prep for a one shot is reading the adventure and lots of experience of running adventures with zero preparation.
Charlie the Turtle says, these are some useful tips, as I might have in the near future a player who always has trouble when having too much unguided freedom. So I introduced Andy Law yesterday to the concept of, you'll all probably know the concept of fight or flight, but actually in response to scary situations, we have 4 responses. Fight is really obvious in the sense that you can all imagine what the player does. They just choose to hit anything you put in front of them. Flight, they just run away. But the other 2 are freeze or fawn, and a lot of anxious players will freeze. So in a situation, they won't know what to do and they'll be scared. Players who come from a really improvisational background will fawn, and fawning is just trying to talk your way out of trouble, essentially trying to appease the person you're with. But I think that concept of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn in terms of your player's preferred style for dealing with a surprise and unknown is quite a good concept to think about.
Yeah, indeed. And if you've got yourself a player who is either new to role playing, new to the setting, or anything similar, providing them with fixed agendas and choices is one of the easiest ways to gently move them into that new setting and that new rule set. Giving them open doors and wide worlds, like, for example, at the beginning of Elden Ring, you come out of your first little tutorial bit, you're given the whole freaking world. That looks like it's entirely open, but it's not, because there's very few choices to make next other than move forward or do nothing. so you move forward. And in many respects, that's different to an RPG, because in an RPG, you don't have a controller acting as in a tabletop RPG, you don't have a controller acting as the interface between you and the world and that clear vision that stands in front of you. You can't give open worlds to new players and expect them to interact as well as they do with a computer role-playing game. They might be completely literate with computer role-playing games, but drop them into a tabletop one and they often freeze. They often complain because they don't know what to do next. So anticipate it and plan for it, and go for giving them, for example, a job. The employer says, go and do A, B, or C. It's up to you how you do it. So the players immediately go, well, I'll do this one, since it's what's been given. And then one day they'll realize, wait a minute, I could do D. I could do F. I could do whatever the heck I want. Why are you even offering me A, B, or C, you terrible quest giver? I'm in a tabletop roleplay game. I'm not in a computer roleplay game. I don't need to choose one of these options. I can do anything. And that's when the game starts to open up. But for new players, don't tell them they can do that. Let them understand it. Show them through the process of the game itself. And you'll find that they will slowly but surely begin to realize that role-playing games offer so much more than their computer game equivalent.
I'm just laughing at this. Imagine your players had to shout direction commands forward, but if you're using like a map, they kind of do. Like if you're representing your characters, you are literally doing that. I suppose for one shots, you also have to curtail your players more than for a campaign, as you have limited time for the action to play out. And
yeah.
These streams are quickly becoming my favorite Saturday evening TV. There's no one else in my family that appears on TV. I am the most famous, and that's that. It's the law.
Thanks. That's super appreciated. I'm glad you're enjoying it. We're really enjoying doing these ones as well, because they're a bit different to how we were doing our previous versions for Inside the Rookery, and it's interesting to see how they're now beginning to land.
Yeah. For those that don't know, I am not the most famous person in my family. There is a brother who is on actual BBC TV most days, so yeah.
Yeah, so truth.
I feel pretty proud that I'm someone's favourite Saturday night. If there is a real risk of a session stalling, could it be useful to put yourself as an NPC in the world so they can request their aid if needed?
Okay, so this is an interesting one about handling PC progress through an established plot line, because sometimes they miss situations that are perhaps solutions that you expect them to get. This actually goes back to another general RPG adage, which is you don't need to create solutions to problems. What you need to do is to create problems for the players to solve. That's largely what you're there as a GM to do. If you create solutions, you'll find that typically they don't use your solutions anyway. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't think it all through. The players like digging their teeth into problems, figuring out how to turn them into hopefully resolved situations as they move from being in a position where they didn't understand to understanding. And that is good. So in this particular case, if you've got players who are having difficulty in general, an NPC is very useful. However, just having one of them come in as an NPC can be weird. So more generally to that, I would suggest having NPCs as part of the friend networks, the backgrounds of your PCs, or alternatively the party of your PCs even, is always useful, because sometimes the PCs just don't get it. And sometimes they just need someone to say, have you looked at that thing over there? Now, if you have ever watched any of the Lawhammer actual plays, I can give you some very clear examples of that from that. We have a character in there called Lucas, our eye patch wearing kidnap magnet. And Lucas is an advisor. He's quite literally a PC advisor. But Lucas, as a character, doesn't advise most of the times, not because our PCs are particularly good at solving things. They're not. They're a bunch of kids mostly who are constantly who are constantly making stupid mistakes. And he's an adult who's largely despairing. He's attempted to advise them at points, but they tend to ignore him and do their own thing. And that's half the fun. In fact, it's more than half the fun. That's absolutely 3/4 of the fun. But sometimes they, when they're going through their discussions about what they think is happening, what's coming next, I can have Lucas just drop in have you considered this? Because it's something that character would say, and he leads them to perhaps a different conclusion. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that because I want the PCs to go in a direction. Indeed, often Lucas gets it wrong. because it's
Lucas
part.
gives really bad advice.
Yeah, he gets it wrong because he's a fallible human, because he's a proper character. He's not just there as a GM mouthpiece. And I would say that there is an issue potentially sitting there. If a GM uses an NPC as their mouthpiece, that it almost sublimates. I mean, it brings down the interaction and agency
Yeah.
of your PCs. The PCs are the ones who are ultimately telling this story. It's not about the NPCs and saying this is the proper way to do it, because there is no proper way. It's a bunch of problems that they've got to solve, and ultimately how they solve them is up to them.
So I've got loads to get through. So thanks for the one shot advice, no problem. RPG group really love to roleplay, so limiting choices. I would like to hear more about that, like what system you play, etc. So pop that in the chat. Hawk Oddly getting ready for work and love having this on. Who is that brother? I've put his Wikipedia link because he's got his own page in the chat. It's not very long though. I mean, it's not a long page. Um, Draymond, for my group, one shots are a bit hard. We do everything through Discord as we all live in different countries. Combat takes really long as everyone takes their turns. Any tips to speed this up?
Right. So, Draymond, assuming I'm pronouncing your name correctly there, Draymond, this is a huge problem for many online gamers, because they've not set up group expectations for how things should proceed. So, my best advice on this is a different sort of preparation. It's not as a GM preparing for the combat and having it as part of it, it's preparing the group. It's sitting down with the group and saying, we've got a really cool adventure coming up. It's a one shot. There's like 3 combats in this, which means we need to get through it quickly, which means everybody needs to have an impact, but we need to resolve these things in a fashion that leaves everyone feeling like they've made a contribution, that their characters have had their moment to shine, but doesn't hold back the overall adventure. Because depending upon what systems you use to play online, some of them are slow. And I don't just mean the role playing game systems you're using, I mean the interface. If you're just using Discord and you don't, for example, have a map that can quickly moving things around. Do we have a
Hello to all the World Anvil people, like up the board.
hey?
Just rated us.
Delighted to
Nice
see
to
you all
see you all.
there. If you're just arriving, we're discussing role-playing games and the prep around role-playing games and how we can keep things, in this particular question, speedily moving along if you're role-playing online.
Yeah, sorry, I've just lost it again. I'll go back to it. Yeah, so you're talking about this from a GM's perspective, aren't you, Andy?
Absolutely, from the GM's perspective. So, planning for this is a core component to ensuring that your one shots land. And the planning isn't, I'm going to have this happen, that happen, the next thing happen. It's planning your actual players into this whole process and discussing with them how you can handle these situations given the fixed environment that you find yourself in, which is on Discord with players who might be in different parts of the world. So, if you're doing that, you need to pre-prep that and possibly dump the rules you're using and use a simpler system. Possibly for combat, giving everyone a single set of options which resolves the whole combat. So, for example, if you are a fighter and you've got some form of melee skill, you're going to be doing one test. That's it. Or maybe 2 tests for the whole thing. And then you're going to narrate what happens after that, seeing who succeeded and who failed, and coming up with some form of resolution. So the planning that you put in place here is planning around the fact that you have limited time, and this is a one shot, and ensuring that everybody understands beforehand, because getting player buy-in is what's going to ensure that the game lands for everybody. Because if players are shocked by this, they'll be like, but wait a minute, that's unfair. My character can do this, and this as well. That's what's on my character sheet. So why isn't that coming up? So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, to go back to your point about using dice as an indicator of what happens and then narrating. So Charlie the Turtle saying, I know one person I might DM will need such an NPC as they can't help but approach the DM directly for help quite often. That player may also struggle in a situation where they're asked to narrate. Like, so you've made this role, tell me how it goes. And in those situations, it's great when the GM kind of role models that and says, oh, that's the role you've got, or this is what happens, and you do this, and helps that player like imagine how their skills manifest in the world, especially if they're alongside other players who do that naturally, who've role played for a long time, because I find that even still now quite intimidating and almost like I'm not doing my character justice. So having you do that as a GM or even an NPC who can not just provide advice for a player, but also provide kind of like a dual
Examples.
do they help you when you're in combat? Do you work together as a team? Is it less of an NPC that the GM controls and more of a henchman like Lucas is? Like, although you control Andy, Ed has some say over how he manifests. I think that can all be quite useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And those
Um,
are references there to the Lawhammer game that we play online. If you want to actually see somebody playing online with NPCs working as henchmen as part of the party.
Thanks for the super chat. I have a nun's habit, therefore you must like me. Noted.
Noted. Oh, creme gelto. Oh.
I'll note that for so Hawkot, are you saying the Bardic Bunny is a mistake? We won't go into that today. We'll talk about the Bardic Bunny another day. Aaron says, if you were to run a weekly game with players
Yep.
dropping in and out any given week, what would be your prep/approach as a GM for that type of game, or am I just a glutton for punishment?
Okay, so to begin with, Aaron, no, you're not a glutton for punishment because this sort of game can be super, super fun. But if it's weekly and players are dropping in and out, there's one thing I would definitely do that's quite different to how I would handle my normal campaigns. And that's that each one of my sessions would need to have, much like a one-shot, a clear beginning, middle, and end. And you would need to ensure that every story was concluded by the end. Now, that story's conclusion might be a cliffhanger which leads into the next session and possibly different people arriving to resolve that cliffhanger. But ultimately, it doesn't necessarily require more prep, necessarily, but it definitely requires more story-based understanding of how you're going to nail down what happens each week. Because if you end up in loose areas that are halfway through stories each week and different players move in, it's going to be unsatisfying to those who aren't in the next session, and it's also going to be unsatisfying to those who step into the next session, because they're going to be left trying to resolve someone else's crap without their own clear beginning because they're halfway through a story. So ensuring that you have planned out clean sessions that hopefully have a nice big arc that goes over all the sessions as well. But planning out each session will make an enormous difference for making it feel like it is a consistent game that they can all move in and out of. So a bit more prep, arguably.
Seagoat's suggestion is a West Marches style game. We do have a couple of streams about those. Anything you'd want to add though for Aaron?
Loosely speaking, I absolutely agree. And West Marches style game, we had a discussion with B Sherry in the past about West Marches. So if you check through our back catalogue, do a search for B Sherry, you'll find a 1 hour chat with B about running a large West Marches game.
Eleanor, that's quite a lot of different systems, some of which I haven't. Candela Obscura, Monster of the Week, Pathfinder. The one shot is going to use Cypher.
Good old Cypher. Good luck with it.
Tradition rhymes with magician. Really enjoying this stream. Thanks both. How do you handle one player being very quiet and timid?
So this is a very common situation. And again, this stream is more about planning. So I'm going to take it purely from the planning perspective.
Good idea.
So I'm trying to make sure that I'm answering questions from that angle. So as a GM, you can plan for quiet players. And by that, I mean you can bring up situations where that particular character is going to have the light shone upon it. But you have to be careful because some characters are shy, some players are shy because they're uncomfortable with the situation, and shining a light in them does nothing more than make them more uncomfortable. So the job here isn't for you to say, you must now talk. Your job is to give them opportunities to do so, and opportunities, importantly, for other characters to engage with them. That could be NPCs or that could be PCs. So situations where you can, for example, request a test from them that gives them information which they then need to share with others. Loosely, what you're doing with characters who are quiet and timid is giving them opportunities to move outside of their standard comfort zone at their own pace. You can't push it. If you push it too far, you're going to leave them uncomfortable. They're not going to enjoy the game. And that's not what we're here for. We're here to have fun. And if they're there and they are having fun and they're being quiet and timid, that's okay. But equally, if they're sitting there going, I really wish I was contributing more, saying more, being involved more, then that is where you as the GM can plan for that to ensure that they're in a position where they're constantly opened up to opportunities where they can then share things they know with others, or perhaps have the answer to a particular situation that nobody has, or perhaps they have the contact that is needed for the next step of the story. So they need to speak to their contact and bring them into the party's sphere of influence so the next stage of the story can then be encountered. Loosely, Your job is not necessarily to change anyone, because some people are like that, and that's cool. And that's
Yeah.
cool. That's cool. Just let's make sure we get that. Some people are going to be happy saying very little, and they're happy. And if you're all there to have fun, what's the problem? Let them be quiet
Yeah.
and timid. That's okay. But if they're not cool with that, then it's your job to gently handhold them until they're in a position
Yeah.
where you can make a difference.
And Wolfsbane and Seagoat have given similar advice that to check out in the chat, which is exactly that, understanding, planning a chat with that player to understand how they want to engage, and if they're quite happy. Some people do just enjoy listening to the story, being part of the story when they want to be part of it, but not jumping in and always being,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
loud and chatty.
Absolutely.
So Kilishandra asks, you touched on this earlier, so I wanted to come back to it. Are solutions as important to plan as problems, or can you leave that all to the players to worry about?
Okay, so yeah, that is definitely worth discussing. This is purely about role play planning. I'm going to give a clean example of this, and this could not be more stark. The number of GM stories that I have read. Now, let's change that for what it actually means. I have commissioned for adventures, and a writer has given me an adventure, and they answer every question that they pose is interesting, because the vast majority of role playing situations don't require that. And this is my example. Let's say you are playing a bunch of relative nobody heroes, as is the common case in many role-playing games, and there is a big bad monster up ahead. The classic D&D fashion of resolving this is, well, the PCs will prevail by kicking its ass in some form or another. But that's nonsense. Largely, it's a problem like anything else that needs to be surmounted. It could be avoided. A thief could creep by, or whatever else you want to go for. Now, when you're writing this situation, there's nothing wrong with saying there is a thing over there that the PCs will not be able to deal with. The ways out are potentially this, but it's going to be up to them to come up with a different form of tackling this. So you've created a problem. Let's say the troll that lives under the bridge. They are just normal human-sized or halfling-sized or little gnome-sized characters that are squiggly along. They have no chance against a troll one-on-one. But that doesn't mean that they can't come up with a solution that will take them out from under the bridge. Now, if a writer tries to bring up all the potential solutions, he will write 30 of them easily, because PCs are naturally creative and each PC brings their own skills to the table. It's far better to simply say the PCs need to get that troll out of the way so they can cross the bridge. How they do that is up to them. Here's 3 examples, but loosely, that's up to them. And there's a host of things you can lay around that area if you desperately want to make it easy, but I'm a GM that prefers not to make it easy. Go wade. Find a different route. Do something else. There is nothing wrong with presenting a problem with no solution that you have in mind, but with PCs who can create their own solutions. And for the idiots that charge it and unfortunately get killed by it, that's their own choice.
The last time we dealt with a troll, we found some explosives from a local inventor and put them inside a bunch of chickens. Dead chickens.
The trolls
and then
ate the chicken.
wheeled the cart out to try to get the trolls to eat them.
Players and the cunning plans. But if you give them answers, say for example, we had ourselves our troll under the bridge, and you put facing this bridge a big explosive shop, that wouldn't be fun.
No.
Because the answer is given to them, the solution is presented to them. Ultimately, players like coming up with their own inventive ways of doing stuff. They don't want to be frustrated. That's something you should always try to ensure doesn't happen. But they do like to come up with their own answers. And you tend to find the more planning that you make to create a solution, the more restrictive you're going to be in allowing the players to solve it. And it's far better to simply go, yeah, there's a big bad thing over here. They don't need to pass that to carry on with the adventure. But if they choose to do so, they could get access to something interesting and fun. And it's up to them to figure out how to get past it. It's not up to me as the GM to figure out the solutions on their behalf. So I'm quite happy moving into those situations without a plan.
We had to string the chickens together to make sure that and we had a bright magister that did help, but I wouldn't recommend that for every problem. If all you have is a exploding chicken, every problem looks like a troll.
Yeah, good times. So loosely speaking, their problems are your primary concern as a GM to present to your players fascinating, interesting, mind-teasing problems. Solutions are not your job to come up with. That's the player's job. But having some to hand so that you can figure out ways that they may attempt to pass it is not a bad idea, but it's
Yeah,
not a core component.
and I think the way UGM, often players who haven't played with you for a while will think that the suggestions you make are like the thing you want them to do. They'll think that NPCs are telling the truth. They'll think that NPCs are suggesting things that you, as Andy, have decided is the best way to solve that problem. And whereas I would say the best GMs like you, like they leave that world open. So there'll be
Yeah.
people in the world that suggest things, just like there's people in the world that'll suggest how we should deal with, I don't know. No, I won't bring real world politics into it, but yeah.
Yeah, quite. Absolutely, in fact. Yeah,
I'm
all of
just gonna
that.
pick a random question. Oh no, we've kind of done that one. As a GM, how do you avoid becoming too attached to a particular planned pathway? For
Mm.
context, as a player, I've been in far too many sessions where the GM has done the prep work, but it's made them too brittle to unexpected player choices.
Right, so actually, this is something that I was alluding to at the beginning of the stream, where too much planning can be to the detriment of some GMs. If you have any attachment to any plan you've made as a GM, you're making a mistake, because players will never, well, that's a complete lie. Players will often go in very different directions or come up with very different solutions to problems that you have posed. If, for example, in fact, I saw a TikTok about this the other day, which was hilarious, it was D&D problems, which is a humor channel that I often catch on TikTok. And loosely, it was the GM presents a big, huge fortress full of bad guys. The players come over and go, "It's a fortress full of bad guys." And he goes, "Yeah, there's a rope bridge that goes over to it. You're going to have to make your way over there." And someone goes, "I throw a fireball at the big castle." And they're like, "Don't be ridiculous. It's a castle." "I throw a big fuse." "Okay, they're all coming out now. The whole castle's coming out, you idiot." They all come out. Oh, so another one goes, "Well, I'll cut the rope bridge." And all the bad guys die because the GM said that they were all on there, and the GM sits there and tosses away 10 pages worth of notes for all the stuff that he intended to happen inside that castle. That is this in essence. That for me was brilliant. I was like, yeah, look at the players. They've managed to kill literally everything in the bad guy castle. Good job. Where that GM was like, well, that's ruined my campaign then, hasn't it? No, it hasn't. The PCs have been inventive. They've done something super cool. This is amazing. It's a D&D logic. Yeah, that's the one there. Just to bring it up there. DM's plan survives contact. Oh, it's the wrong one. You moved on to that one. Yeah, totally, Maddie. It was actually freaking hilarious. I read it, I watched it, and I laughed. But I think that is a perfect example of where GMs who do too much planning do so to their own detriment. There's nothing wrong with setting up a castle with all sorts of crazy stuff in it that you've figured out, and that's cool. But once you've done that, how the players interact with that is almost certainly not going to be what the plan suggests. And allowing the players the latitude and freedom to have their own agency is a core component of role playing. Railroading, I will now say, contrary to this, isn't bad as long as everybody understands what's happening and they feel like they have agency along those tracks. Having said that, though, too much planning and getting effectively annoyed if the players don't do what you want is so unlike a useful place to be for a GM that it's almost painful. Your planning is there so that everybody has fun, and if the players come in and have fun in a way that you don't expect, surely that's a good thing because they're having fun. And that's what we're all there to do. So on this one, how do I do this? How do I plan this? I don't care. And that's basically it. Now, that doesn't mean I don't care what the stories are. In fact, I worry over all the various story arcs and the backgrounds and the different NPCs and what they're doing and whatever. I have far too much thoughts running through my head as I pace around the house trying to figure out what's going to be the next part of the story. I'm a bit of a pacer. I plan a lot of my thoughts inside my head. My daughter's sitting over in the corner laughing at me because she's watched me pace before one of our sessions when we're going live for a live stream. She's literally grinning over there. So I do all of that, but simultaneously, I'm not doing that so that I can figure out what they're going to do. I'm doing that so I have all the NPCs in place, so I understand where they could go, all the different things that are out there. I understand different ways of presenting a scene that could be super fascinating and interesting to the players to entertain them. So I'm not attached to any of my plans. I literally don't care about them. I'm attached to the story being as awesome as possible. And whenever the players do something unexpected and the glee spreads across their face, that is the plan, ultimately. Because I'm planning for them to have fun.
Hawkwoodley says, Lindsay, you need to get some candid footage of this pacing. No, because when he paces, it makes me anxious. So when he paces, he has to do it in a separate room to me.
It's
So,
true.
Corner Goblin can get the footage, but I
Yeah,
refuse.
last Friday, I was feeling super constricted because it was pelting it down.
Mm.
And every Friday we role play over in Lawhammer in the actual play stream. And it was pelting it down outside. And I was wanting to pace about on the outside because I was trying to figure out an alternative way of presenting some information in terms of how the plot was going to be presented. And I didn't have that space. So I ran it far more clean and far more basic than I would have done in a different way.
Yeah. Okay, there's a question. In Scotland, we would say Aaron, but I have become aware recently from someone I know who's American that Aaron with two A's is sometimes not pronounced Aaron. It's pronounced like Aaron. So just a side quest there to find out how to pronounce your name, Aaron. Not Aaron, but more like Aaron. Anyway, running Master from first edition, converting to fourth edition in real time at the moment. Have converted first chapter to fourth, sort of. What would be your prep and what would you say to avoid as a waste of time?
Okay, so I'm going to say something that many perceive to be absolutely blasphemous. I rarely prep stats. They are a waste of time under most situations. I'm far more interested in prepping character. Who are they? How do they present? What do they sound like? What is their goals? All of that matters. The number of times that I'm going to be having stat on stat situations are almost nil for the vast majority of the NPCs in my games. So the vast majority of the NPCs in Master, I just wouldn't be statting. I just, they go and speak to this person, they go speak to that person, they go speak to the next person. That's all fine. That's not requiring anything more than perhaps charm tests or some equivalent from the PCs. So it's going to be very much agency with them, not agency with the NPCs. When it comes to combat, I rarely stat the vast majority of it for my own personal games. Obviously, if you're doing it professionally, they must be understood. So you must stat them and you must stat them well, which I would argue many games do not. I'd also argue that many games shouldn't stat what they've done because the number of different types of groups that they've got that are going to be pitched against these NPCs is so varied that if you stat them, you might mean that you've turned that bad guy into an indestructible one or a walkover. Which is a concern. But if you're doing it for yourself, all I really, really worry about is how well do they hit and how much damage can they take? All the rest of it is superfluous. All the rest of it's just a ton of numbers. That said, I do like to sometimes stat my NPCs because they are important and it helps me characterize them. Because through the process of building their characters, I go, oh, well, actually, they know a lot about the arts. Okay, so they've got a hobby. They've got things that they're doing, which I wouldn't do if I was keeping it down to simple numbers. And that helps me do a bit of extra characterization. Now, if I was doing Master, I would read it through 3 times. That's it. That's all I do. I would do no more prep. I don't recommend that for other people, but that's because I have so much improvisational experience that I just then, having got the whole idea, the arc of the adventure in my mind, I then just make up my own version of it when I sit down and play, reading maybe the sections that perhaps are going to be relevant before each section, just to give me a reminder of the general direction. But that's it. I don't do big preps in that regard because I tend to find the more I prep and the more I try to make it match the text, the more stilted the delivery and the more that players feel like I'm reading from a book. And nobody really wants that. They want to be engaged with the gaming world. And it's much more fun, I have found, if the PCs are directly engaging with me rather than engaging with me through a book. So I try to avoid doing that. And the only way to do that is read it as many times as makes it sink into your mind. But everyone is going to have their own ways of prepping up for that sort of thing.
So if you know your PCs are going to a particular town or city in the next session, Lore Master of Sotek asks, what are the fundamental pieces to have in place when having PCs enter a town or city? How much of it do you need to have prepared to deal with their exploration?
Right, so this is an interesting question because of how it's phrased. The fundamental pieces are quite different to the useful pieces. What's fundamental is the parts that have to be there? And my answer here may surprise. The only thing that you really need to have is, what is this settlement? The answer to that has to be the tones, the feel, the general character of this place. And if you want to answer it correctly, how is it different to everywhere else? So, for example, if you're playing Game A and they go to Andytown, as you create Andytown, you think, okay, how is Andytown different to all those other towns? What's the bits that stand out? Because the vast majority of the times that people move through a game, they already are aware of the core base stereotypes. So there's no point in saying it's yet another town with walls and buildings and a castle and a river or whatever else it might be. All those things that are almost expected. What you need to do is focus on the things that make people go, oh, this place is different, because everybody has a local culture that manifests differently, or their clothes are different, or the buildings that are here are unique in some fashion, or there's something else that makes this town Andy Town rather than Lindsay Town. Or Marktown, or whatever else it might be. So the only thing I'm going to be doing is starting nothing, not caring about any location, make it up as I go, but I make it up within the framework of what that place would have, because I have considered the core fundamental of what is this place. And in terms of my story, what is it there for? That is all that matters. The rest of it can be made up on the fly. That's my angle on fundamental pieces. There is obviously a ton of extras you could do, useful stuff. Locate a couple, drop a couple of locations in you know that they're going to go to in the first section. Why on earth wouldn't you quickly make up those? Even if it's just, I'll have a wee think. There'll be an inn. It's called Andytown Inn. Excellent. And it's run by Andytown's Inn man. Excellent. No, let's make it Andy Townsend woman. Oh, my previous prejudices getting in the way there. Ooh. And slowly but surely you can build up something that's fun. But again, the stats aren't necessarily going to help with any of that. In fact, they're not going to help at all, because they're never going to be used probably at the table. What's much more interesting is, what is this place like? How am I going to try and portray it? And this fundamental question is thus answered. I need tone. I need motifs. I need basic storytelling tools, the storytelling tools that you would often deploy if you were building, say, a short story or a novel. I need to answer that for the character that is that town and location.
I'm just ignoring all the comments about Andy Town, Lindsay Troy. Where is Andy Town in relation to
the Funky Town? And I think Hawk has got the most important one. Dork's Deeds Town is a town that everybody should visit, and you can do so right now, because I'm a shill, and I am absolutely going to tell you to go and pre-order Dark Deeds, which you can do right now. A game brought to you by Warhammer Legends, Mark Gibbons, Andy Chambers, people that you might know on this very stream. We helped put this game together. If you would like to get an absolutely marvelous game about malicious minions working for a dark patron, attempting to work their way down the street and do naughty deeds, that is actually hilarious, that's the game for you. It's freaky amazing. It only takes about an hour or so to play, and it's super fun. You can pre-order it now from the comments that are sitting down below YouTube, and not the comments, pardon me, the description. I can't believe I just moved that over to a shilling, but I did.
So Tradition asks, so how much time would you spend prepping for a session? And from that, anything essential you pop in front of you when running the session?
Right, so this massively changes according to the session at hand. Some sessions I do no preparation, literally none, because it's an adventure that I have either read many times, or I have presented many times, or it's a sandbox where the players are encountering the world and doing their own thing. I just turn up and I go, hey players, you're here. What's up, guys? Where are we going? Zero prep. Away we go. It's cool. If, for example, it's the Lawhammer stream, every single session has got a starting point from whatever was occurring last week, obviously. And generally there is a plan as to moving forward. Now, that's really all the plan is, moving forward. So there's always the next step being taken to ensure that we don't ever get caught up in story, we don't want to get caught up telling dull stories. So we need to have constant movement, because it's a game that's being streamed online for an actual play. It has a different set of requirements. And that means I have to plan things to occur. Now, I can't count to you how many times I've planned a thing and they've not done it because they've done something else. And that's cool. Or because I've improvised something else. That's also super cool. But I do more prepping for that. If I'm prepping for a one-off, I will do much more prepping. I will prep that bad boy back to front and will probably create new handouts, because if I create new handouts, I will have written every single letter and word in it, which means that they will lodge into my brain far more clearly than if it's a printed one that I've got from somebody else. You'll tend to find that I will often create stuff specifically for one-offs, just so that it's all lodged in my head so that I never need to refer to my notes. Because my plan is for whenever I sit down at a session to not have to refer to my notes. And ultimately, that is where I would land on this one. I do as much prep as is required to get the outcome that I want for the session ahead without ever looking at my notes. If you ever, for example, see me looking at notes in the Lawhammer stream, I'm generally doing something else.
What are you doing?
That's often recording things for later or noting something.
Oh, there's a question about
doing
that.
something.
Aaron. I thought it was going to be Aaron.
Aaron, well done.
Not Aaron. Not Aaron. Okay. Something
Definitely
about...
not Aaron.
No, it's not Aaron. I can't find the comment. So annoying. There's definitely a comment that I wanted to
While you're
bring
doing
up,
that, I'll just say
but
you're
I've
absolutely
lost it.
correct, Seagoat. There's never a dull story in Andy Town.
Let's just ask, Charlie the Turtle says, should you plan out some emergency plans to nudge the players if you know it might be a more complicated situation?
This is interesting. I'm going to actually use a direct example from the game I'm currently running, because I think that provides at least an answer, certainly not the answer, but an answer. I'm currently working through the Enemy Within campaign. Don't worry, there'll be no spoilers here. And the part that we're working our way through is the Power Behind the Throne. Now, you might never have read this adventure. I'm largely working from the first edition version plus all the notes that I took for adapting it. And it is a relatively infamous adventure for being notoriously difficult to run for two primary reasons. Now, I'm going to argue three. The first one is because it was written by someone who was under the influence, and it's crazy. And it took some heavy editing to move it into a place to turn it into what I think is arguably one of the best adventures that Warhammer ever got. But the reasons why it's difficult is because the signposting for the players is negligible, and the number of NPCs at hand is enormous in a situation that has literally nothing to do with the core plot. Nothing. They're in the middle of a giant carnival that has nothing to do with the core plot, with thousands of NPCs getting thrown at them, doing thousands of cool stuff, while the main plot kicks around in the background. And it's fascinatingly difficult to run. I have run it so many times. I've run it for one person, I've run it for groups of 10, I've run it for groups of 4, and they've all landed differently. And every single time I have come up with different answers. And one of my answers, for example, was to directly control how the PCs work their way through by literally giving them answers to each step to ensure that they figured it all out by the end. That was, however, ultimately less satisfying for them. I've done ones where I didn't give them any hints, and they missed the adventure completely and ended up leaving the city, which really wasn't the plan, which is also super fun, but very different. So to directly answer this one, should I plan some emergency plans to nudge my players in the right direction if it's a complicated situation? This is a complicated adventure. Did I pre-think out ways that the PCs could engage with it? Yes. Did I think of things that I would do to drag them back on track? No. Because I want them to make their own track. However, I did change the adventure in a couple of places, changed an NPC or two, so if they crossed those NPCs, the information download they'd receive would be a bit bigger. Would actually provide them with a hook or two extra to explain the next step, but done so in an organic way, with NPCs who would be able to say those things because of who they are and the position that they're in. I then presented the various worlds around them and let them engage with it, and it all sort of happened as I expected. But that's because I figured what they definitely would do, and I didn't so much plan so that I could nudge. Instead, I planned for the things that they do, providing them with enough to understand what to do next. So my plan was a bit more deliberate, but I really don't like nudging. It's not my preference. If the PCs don't get the plan, I've already failed. I've not articulated things clearly enough for them to understand what the plan was, which means my plan was rubbish in the first place.
This was the question I couldn't find, and when Turning Leaf has rewritten it for me, which is just
Thanks, Turning Leaf.
nice. How much do you make use of campaign chronicle style notes, writing freeform resumes of sessions as a way to remember past sessions?
Okay, so I find this fascinating because PCs tend to take notes. Now, not all of them. You tend to find that there are 2 or 3 who will diligently never take a note, and what notes they take are terrible. Equally, there'll be a PC or 2 who will diligently take notes, and they will be absolutely amazing, and they will all sometimes contradict your own memory of what occurred of a particular event. I tend not to take these notes. I've got my own campaign notes that sit in the background, but they're often much more macro. They're big level stuff, how things are working, going, rather than the specifics. I will have already thought out all the NPCs, so I don't really need to worry about what one said yes or no about a particular situation, because it's almost hard coded into their characters. They just are who they are. So I don't necessarily need to keep notes, like I don't keep notes on who Andy is and what Andy did in the past. I kind of don't need that. And for my hundreds of NPCs, they kind of don't need it either, because they all act in different ways. So I tend not to do this because that's not what I do, but others do, and that's useful. I will say, though, that if you're playing a game like, say, an online game where everything is being watched and can be rewatched at any time, that both completely dismisses the need for them, because you can just rewatch it. You can just go back and go, what happened? All right, got it. Or alternatively, people out there will be taking notes on your behalf. They'll be sitting out there going, this is what happened in this session. What does it all mean? And that's brilliant. But personally, I don't do this. But I'm now going to contradict myself completely. I am pretty unique in how I organize my campaigns. And I don't think that my disorganized approach is at all wise. And it's not what I generally recommend others do. I don't recommend a complete campaign chronicle per se, but I do recommend a quick notebook with core decisions made, core NPCs, what they've done, how they've moved on. You'll find that it's not big. Vast majority of sessions are generally only 3, 4, 5 scenes. That's only 3, 4, 5 notes that you need to take down as a GM as to what actually happens. So I do think it is absolutely worth it. I do think that bullet points are significantly better than stories, because you'll actually record bullet points, because it's short points that you can recall with ease and note with ease, rather than long stories where you might have all the enthusiasm to begin with, but after story number 7, you're beginning to go, I don't have time for this crap. I'd much rather just be living or playing Dragon's Dogma 2 or whatever the hell else. That will really date this video if by any chance you're watching it 2 years down the line. Or whatever else it is that you might actually rather be doing than writing your next short story about what happened in your last campaign. Ultimately, I think the most important answer to this is, what do you find most fun? And that is the real answer. If you hate taking notes, you're never going to enjoy being a GM that takes notes. So don't do it. Find another way to ensure that you're getting fun out of your game. If you're a GM that loves notes, go to town, because you have ample opportunity to construct entire worlds. If I think of my vampire game, for example, that one had literally every single vampire in the world marked in it. I am that crazy. All 40,000 of them.
I'm really, so we've actually almost finished, but Aaron says, made big mistake of letting players think they could catch up to the prince for bold adventurers wanted. Bogenhafen is wrecked onto Leichmaster. Help wanted poster and like is similar. I just bring this up because I'm actually desperate to know whether the help wanted poster that we found will like come round again, because we totally missed being able to catch up with the prince. And I'm like, did we just miss that, or were we never supposed to? Could we? Because then we wouldn't have been in Middenheim. We would have been in the Grey Mountains. I'm so curious about that.
That will get an answer, in our game at least. And I'm willing to answer an extra couple of questions if there's any ones that we can go through fast, if there was any dropped into the pre-question. In case there was any there.
Lore Master, so how deeply should you develop NPCs in anticipation of PCs interacting with them? What are good fail-safes to have for if there's an important NPC they ignore? And he'd also added, or like a random PC that they just like get fixated upon. I get fixated upon people.
Okay, so I think, have I paused or is just Lindsay
No?
paused? If someone could note that in the chat, that'd be amazing. At the moment, I'm definitely here. So, as far as I'm concerned, you can still see me. So, I'm just going to carry on. So, how deeply should I develop NPCs, or should you develop the NPCs? As deeply as you need to understand who they are. That's it. Now, for some people, that will be literally just 3 words. 3 words that speak to their character. Like, for example, vibrant, chatty, and shy, which is a lovely little combination. And you've just with those 3 words encapsulated everything you need. If you then say this vibrant, chatty, and shy person is also a lore master, suddenly, by the nature of their job and the nature of the description, you're done. Just done. There's nothing else to say. You're finished. So that's great. For other people, they like stats, they like recording it all down, and that's cool. But if you're a GM who finds all of that just a waste of time, don't beat yourself up about it. All you need to have is enough to portray those characters. And the last one there, what's a good failsafe? If they miss an important NPC, how? How can you miss an important NPC would be the bigger one. And that would suggest a failure on the GM's part to introduce the NPC and put them in front of them. And you control the world. I would argue that there is almost no way that an important NPC can be missed unless you choose for that to be the case. Now, you might have created yourself a world where you have backed yourself into a corner, painted through your narrative, you into this tiny little unpainted corner where there is nowhere this NPC can now be. If that's the case, paint something else behind you. You have the entire world at your fingertips, and the PCs don't know what's coming next. All of your plans don't matter until the PCs hear them, which means all of the stuff you've created in your head literally means nothing. Mm-hmm. All of the notes you've made mean nothing. All the maps that you've created are water that can just drift by and be changed into anything else because you are the GM. Now, if you're the GM that does something like this, right, so Bob just walks out because of what you've done, that's clearly nonsense. You build a good story around ensuring this NPC has a route in, but that's not difficult. So my answer for the second part is you don't need fail safes. What you need is more practice at GMing and making shit up on the spot. And that is what I would recommend. And the best way to do that is do yourself a couple of sandbox games, which are just games that are without real plot to begin with. The plot will unfold as the players engage with the sandbox world. If you're playing Warhammer, just take the Uber's Right starter set and play an Uber's Right and see what happens. Don't play a fixed adventure. Give them the city. Get them a basic start off job, as in you're adventurers looking for money or some nonsense like that, and see where they go. And then make it up as you go along. And you'll find that your improvisational skills significantly improve through doing so.
Is there any way to prepare for the case that a player might drop out without knowing it ahead of time?
Yes, absolutely. And that is ensuring that none of your players are core to the central plot, which means that you can't do the enemy within, because the enemy within requires one person to be core to the central plot, which is stupid. There was some discussion about actually removing that, but of course we couldn't. It's actually stupid. And by doing that, and ensuring that they're not the only important character, that the plot's not centered in them, that the plot is more broadly understood, ensures that players dropping in or out won't impact the story. Further, to ensure that groups are not utterly handicapped by the loss of someone, it's always worthwhile having some NPCs along who are henchmen, who are advisors, who are guides, who are perhaps employed to look after people because they're scholars, whatever it might be, because they can provide just bulk of conversation. If, for example, you drop to 2 players or even 1, then you're in a position where there's lots of characters who can interact with the PCs at hand and can keep the plots moving along at a good pace. So broadly, my answer to that is plan more broadly rather than specifically for individual stories, if this is a concern, and ensure that you've got a solid NPC base to keep the general plots moving forward.
Ever collect artwork to share with players?
Do we collect artwork at this end? Oh, as in, do I? Yes, sometimes,
to
but
share with players.
oh yeah, to show to players. Yes, sometimes I consider doing this for the Power Behind the Throne, and indeed drew half the NPCs for it. And I may still use those later because I'm half tempted. In fact, I'm actually tempted to stat them all up for my Lawhammer game in a way that's completely different to the printed versions. Because I just feel their characters should be deeper. So I'm half tempted to do that, but I tend to find that the power of the theatre of the mind is often better than telling everybody that someone looks a certain way. It has its
Yeah.
flaws in that sometimes somebody went, wait a minute, what? I thought that person had dark hair, not blonde. How could you say blonde? Because of a misunderstood point or whatever. But I do this sometimes, and I do think it's worthwhile sometimes. For some people, it deeply aids immersion. But I often find that sometimes people will focus on these things and they will create characters that don't exist, which is cool, actually, because then misapprehensions occur. But sometimes they will then say, that's not what the character is, it's this, and it can create weird tensions at the table. But it can be fun.
There's a Dark Deeds question. As we're over time, I will allow it. Still loading.
Yes.
I'm wondering if there are any gods in Dark Deeds. Waited till
Yes,
the end to
not
ask.
not only that still loading, but we're actually considering a game called Dark Deities. So be aware of that. If we get enough sales of Dark Deeds out there, then we will definitely plow ahead with Dark Deities. Dark Deeds at the moment is doing all right. It could be doing better. If you'd like to support your plucky little indie publishing company, please do go and pre-order the game. I can't express how much of a difference it's going to make for us here at the Rookery. And it's a one-off little thing. We know it's only one game, but it makes a huge difference. If you would like to, please do. I'm not that I'm desperate or anything, but please do.
Yeah, having a plot rely on one character being in the party, given how deadly Warhammer is, and over 5 books, is bonkers.
Yeah, and I can't express, Aaron, how much it upset me, particularly given that I'm live streaming a version of this game now, and I have to plan for that character dying.
And he's spent a lot of fate points, right? I can see them
Yeah.
all from here.
Yeah, totally. So that is most certainly a potential issue. Warhammer is much less deadly than people claim. And I don't just mean the rules are. I mean, it's got extra lives. You're basically like Mario. You've got fate points. You run along, and I'm not saying you punch lizards on the head and make their tongue stick out, but I am saying that you do have extra lives, and those extra lives mean that even basic PCs tend to last for at least 12 sessions. It takes something special for you to actually die in your first session, your first, let's say, set of sessions that you play. But nevertheless, Warhammer is still pretty deadly. So yeah, it is bonkers.
Martin asks, what could published adventures add to aid GM prep?
Okay, so this is super fascinating. Because the vast majority of published adventures are presented to be GM prep. And by that, I mean they provide you with all your NPC blocks, they provide you with your locations, they provide you with a plot that moves through these locations and these stat blocks, they provide you with a host of motivations for the NPCs, and they are the GM prep. And that is largely how most view them. And they will often have a paragraph or maybe two near the beginning which says how to use this adventure. And that almost always says something like this: read it. And that's all it says, which is ultimately not actually useful, because to even reach that point, you've got to be bloody reading it in the first place. And often they treat GMs almost like they're children, and they say something like this: read it twice. Now, it's really hard to remove that, because you do need to remind, especially first-time GMs, that they really should read the whole thing before they start trying to run the thing. So don't just read the first few paragraphs and go, I think I've got enough to start the session. Do that, and then find they go in a different direction, and you don't know where the plot's going, so thus you don't know what to improvise. So understanding the story, yeah, do that. Read it. But there is a variety of things that could be added to books to make it better. What can you do to prep for this particular type of adventure? If it's a dungeon crawl, is there something to say about potentially prepping in a way that isn't normally said? By getting the maps out, by presenting the nature of the adventure in a different way to your players, perhaps playing with miniatures or playing with a piece of virtual tabletop software so that they can make their way through an area. If, for example, it's a city-based adventure, could you prep for that adventure by giving them a big map with places that they could go to that they can see because there are major landmarks already marked upon that? Could they do that? The vast majority of city books don't provide that sort of map. So is there things that could be done inside published adventures? The list is as long as my arm, and then all the other arms that attach to it. The answer is yes. The vast majority of them don't provide you with the tools to prep. They just provide you with a book to read, and they claim that is the prep, where in truth, actually running the adventure generally takes more than what the adventure itself says.
Thank you. That's very fair. When turning leaves, I'm currently waiting to see if Dark Deeds is coming to a board game shop near me, and trying to avoid paying for shipping out of the UK.
I get that. If you're in the, it's worth noting that there's a hub in the US as well. So if you happen to be in the US, they're shipping from the US too.
But if you're not in either of those two places,
and if you're looking for it to come to shops near me, the number of them being ordered is low. I doubt it's going to happen. From what I can see with the number that we have currently, the vast majority of them are going to go to pre-orders or into the UK distribution system. And that's about it, except for some that will almost certainly be going to the US hub, which means if you don't order, you may not get. Just
where do you live? Warning. I'm planning a road trip. I'm going to go around Europe delivering Dark Deeds to people.
Yeah, so just a word of warning, that is a potential issue that we have because its first print run will be small because it's an unknown quantity for all parties.
I've got loads more questions. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, I'm happy to throw out a few extra. We've been streaming all day. Why not stream for an extra 10 minutes?
How different is it to plan for a streamed game than a more standard one?
Hugely. This hasn't come as a surprise for me because I knew that I was presenting a visual piece of entertainment over the standard RPG session. And there are certain things that I was going to do that I chose not to because the amount of prep required was so high. For example, making pictures for every NPC, putting stat blocks up for NPCs on screen, doing all of those things. That would be cool from the presentation point as an actual play, but I felt that in the end it felt less real. It felt like it was a production. It felt like it was almost like professional slick telly and not what we all do when we gather around our living room to just have fun for an evening. So I ended up choosing not to do that. Nevertheless, the amount of prep per session is still, I would say from my side, much higher than it would have been if I was just inviting my mates round to play for an evening, because many of the sessions are presented completely differently. I'll give some examples without spoilers. We've had flashbacks. Flashbacks require preparation. They require a story with a beginning, middle, and end. That also requires much more preparation. They're much more like a one-shot. And we have had multiple one-shots. And as I said earlier in the stream, one-shots require more prep. We have had a variety of sessions that have taken multiple points of views. Multiple points of views require preparation. You can't do all those extra things that are external to the PCs and external to their choices without figuring out what the hell's going to happen with that, all of that, without any PC interaction at all. That takes work. We have had sessions that take place entirely within the framework of a story, so unreliable narrators, which also have actual ends which aren't just pre-planned. It's an existing story, so it has to end in a particular way, even though the players are playing it, not the PCs. The players are playing through that, so that also requires significantly more prep. Having said that, I have still managed to streamline it to the point where I do as little prep as humanly possible, and that's not because prep is something I don't enjoy. I really do. I'm very process driven. I like having all the plans in place and building big spreadsheets of stuff. But I don't have time. As has been noted a couple of times in this, I'm streaming or I'm writing or I'm producing or I'm doing something else. So this entire actual play that we're doing over on Lawhammer has been designed around doing as little preparation as possible, and also showing everybody else out there who happens to be watching it that you can run a game like this with no more prep other than reading the book and thinking of different ways that you could present it in a different way. So, yeah, it's different, Kilishandra.
There's another question from Charlie the Turtle. With how much planning goes into a one-shot, would you suggest it for a first-time creator?
Hey, Charlie
And
Turtle.
Seagoat
Yeah.
actually asked a question about one-shots as well. Let me just find it. For one-shots or two-shots, how much planning do you actually need? Can you just turn up with a plot hook and a few pre-gens and wing it for the remainder of the session?
Okay, so that's a different sort of session than the one I'm going to necessarily argue, right? So first, one shot. Planning for a one shot, if you're doing something to just basically show off a system and show off the world, yeah, you should plan it. If you don't plan it, it's just going to be a meandering mess that you can't fix in the next session. That you can't. Now, it might land perfectly. It might just, you come up with a silly little adventure hook, you play out that adventure hook, and by the end of the session, the story has finished. But that's going to be luck mixed with your own experience that gets it there. It's not going to be because that was how it was going to turn out or planned to turn out, and you probably don't know how it's going to end either. And that's super fun for one shot. Some of the best games that are out there are designed around improvisation and working towards a shared story that has a conclusion by the end of it that is entirely unplanned. You can all just get around and have your little fiasco and see exactly how it actually falls out through the course of play. And I use the word fiasco on purpose because that's the game, and that's how that one works. So if you're a first-time creator and you're making your own adventure for a setting, one-shots, I would actually argue the other side, are the best place because they teach you how to do correct writing, correct planning, ensuring that everything is covered, making sure your plot lines are simple enough but also complicated enough, making sure that you present problems with solutions the players can come up with rather than necessarily saying they'll find the key on page 33. Would you like to go to page 24 next? That is plodding delivery of plot. It's much better to give problems for them to tackle and that the PCs work their way through those, perhaps giving them clues for different ways of resolving it through the course of their skills or something similar, but not necessarily constraining them so. But yeah, I think actually, given how much planning it is, it's really good practice for first-time creators. First-time GMs, it's almost essential to one-shot first because it will teach you more than almost anything else. And by one-shot, I mean take someone else's adventure, read that 3 or 4 times, and you're done. That's your prep.
How long is the pre-order for Dark Deeds? What I'm asking is if it's within time to order next week when I get the bank card in the mail.
Yeah, it should be Magnus K. Yeah, you should be fine. Absolutely fine for that. We Magnus don't know how long.
Magnus is in Norway, I think, so that is definitely a candidate on the train trip destination.
You do want to go to Norway. You got to practice your Norwegian after all.
You do.
Yeah, absolutely. What was Seagoat's question again, just so I can bring that one? And I think I half answered it rather than fully answered it.
Seagoat's got loads of questions.
That was the one on the banner.
Here you go.
Thank you. How much planning do you actually need? If you're doing it, 2 shots less, I would argue, than 1. If you're doing it for a con or if you're doing it to highlight a system, as I said, I can't recommend knowing what you're going to do enough. Just a plot hook and a few pre-gens and winging it requires an experienced GM, which in your case you are, but many aren't. So for those who aren't, it is pretty much going to fall about them unless they are lucky or they just happen to be very good at improvisation. The vast majority of GMs will not do it very well, but if they have a very clear plan for a beginning, middle, and end, and a clear way of ensuring that everybody's hooked into it, then it's great. I will say one thing, that if you are doing a one-shot, there's one thing you need to focus on, I would argue, more than any other part of the one-shot, and that's the hook. That is what gets your players going in the direction of the planned plot. If you don't have a hook that feels natural and actually works, it immediately puts a sour note from the beginning. That hook could be all your players already know that they're working for someone and that they have to go and do whatever that person said. That hook could be that they see someone that needs to be rescued, and the nature of the characters that they're playing means that they will try to rescue that thing. You've got to do something to ensure that they immediately engage, because then once they're engaged, the nature of the way plots work means that they will have a beaten path that they can then follow as clues or NPCs or whatever else reveal the next steps for them. But the first part, the actual hook, is the bit that I would argue you need to pay most attention to. And often, if you've got that, the rest of it kind of falls into place with even the simplest plan of A, B, C, D, NPC 1, 2, 3, 4, and away they go with a few names.
Oh, that's such a nice comment. This is all such good one-shot advice. I'm not an experienced GM, so I'll be reading materials multiple times. Eleanor, Andy did a few other streams earlier in the year on GMing as well that you might find useful. They'll be on the Rookery Publications playlist, inside the Rookery playlist. Maybe we could put some little cartons though up in this video, Andy, that links to other videos.
Yeah, good idea. I'll drop in afterwards. Also, when I edit the Lawhammer video from its enormous run of black at the end.
Martin has asked, in longer campaigns, is retroactive planning a useful tool for GMing? And the context is, by retroactive planning, I mean having a lot of irons in the fire, but they're superficially described, maybe no more than a name to spark some improv. You only go back to flesh things out, and I couldn't fit it all in, but when a player encounters it, or if it comes up in the course of play.
Absolutely, Martin, 100%. There is nothing like sowing seeds and watering them later. But I will also argue that retroactive planning is not just about the seeds that you necessarily sow, but this is the seeds that the players sow. As players make their way through their plots, they will say, aha, I have discovered, let's say, Bob the Builder is acting strangely. And you're like, no, I just had a cold. Wait a minute. No, Bob the Builder is acting strangely. The seed has been sown. And you can then retroactively look at that NPC and say, well, Bob the Builder's suspicious, isn't he? Now, that is for long-term campaign often gold, because the PCs not only have agency, they are also interacting directly with the ongoing plot, and they are helping build that game world. It's not just about you and what you feel are great stories. Often the PCs will build better stories than any you could have made up. So 100% retroactive planning is well worth it. Completely agree.
I just found the link. I've popped it in the chat.
Should be nice and easy to click through on there for you later, Eleanor.
Should indeed. Did we ask this one? What necessities to have planned out for a long-term campaign? Conversely, what might seem important to have planned but really is not and can be done along the way?
Yeah, so there, I do have a couple of points on this one that I think stand contrary to most people's advice. For a long-term campaign, you need to know the overall arc. You don't need to know the next step, the first step, the 12 steps that lead to it, but you do need to know what the whole point of the story is that you're telling. For example, if you are playing campaign 1 and the point of the story is a god is attempting to manifest in Andytown, that needs to be introduced at the beginning. It needs to be discussed halfway through. It needs to be nailed home as you move towards the end, and it needs to be the end. You need to know just how badly Andytown is going to be screwed by this god, or how much it's potentially going to benefit. You need to then start adding your complications as you go. You don't need to know the stats of Andy McAndyton, who works in the local inn. None of that really matters. Indeed, the vast majority of what's coming between the beginning and the end doesn't matter yet. All that matters is that you know what the campaign is about. I would also strongly argue that you move away from standard campaign building and you consider instead standard literary advice for how to write novels. Take a look at novel building advice, and what they suggest is important for ensuring that your novel has more depth than just, I've written a string of scenes, a string of events that's ended in a way, boom, done. When they consider tone, when you consider recurring motifs, when you consider the overall theme of the piece, when you consider a whole host of basic narrative techniques, pull out and do that for the campaign. And suddenly it will be a bigger story that has actual depth running all the way through it, rather than necessarily the string of individual events that leads to that. Because every event that you then create, you can go, yes, but is that going towards the overall narrative campaign's theme? Have I reinforced the theme with this tone? And if the answer is no, then you can go, well, what will add to that scene to make it better? And this is a failing of the vast majority of campaigns that are pre-written out there, because they're often written by multiple authors, all of whom are only concerned with their individual section. And that individual section will have different recurring tone, themes, motifs to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And I'm going to call out one in particular for this from Warhammer, just so that you can get an example that if you want to read it, you can do so. And that's the Thousand Thrones campaign. It was a campaign that was written in relatively short order for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. And each one of the various authors that were involved in it were extremely talented, very good at their job. However, there wasn't a clear overarching purpose to the linking through of their plots, the recurring motifs, ensuring that each step built towards the end, and come the end, it was a satisfactory end to each of the component parts that built up towards it, because they naturally flowed one into the next. Instead, it was lots of loose, disparate stories that were kind of tied together because they sort of made sense to follow on from each other, with a giant dungeon bash at the end. So I'm not going to say it was bad. I personally think that it was not the best built campaign ever put there. I'm being generous. But it's an example of what you probably shouldn't do. So my advice here is, what is necessary to understand what the campaign is, and what is not necessary, anything in the campaign. That can come as you get moving. And if you're doing a pre-prepped one, so for example, if you're playing The Enemy Within, I strongly recommend reading it and going, right, so what actually is the under message? What's the theme of this? What is being done? And if there isn't one, make one. Get one so that you can run it in a unique and interesting way.
Kilishandra asks, do you count world building as session prep, and why?
No, but it is. And by that I mean, your world building and building the world that everyone's going to play in is quite clearly preparation for playing the game, because you need to understand the world in order to present that world to your players. And world building can be nothing more than reading somebody else's world building. For example, if you're playing in Ravenloft, you read the Ravenloft books. If you are playing in Vampire the Masquerade, you go and read vampire books and you read your way through them. And that is, in many respects, world building. It's someone else's world building being downloaded into your brain, but you're still world building. But that is not preparation for individual sessions. And when I consider preparation for, let's say, my next session of Warhammer, I'm not going to be sitting there going, well, of course, this session was prepped by the 20 years worth of Warhammer reading I've done previous to 20 years. Yeah, no. Oh, shit, I'm a lot older than that. I did not say 20, 30, 40 years. Crap. Let's just not even think about that too hard and simply say, I don't think of it as my session prep. My session prep is the work that I do to present the next session, or a session, or to write an adventure that someone else will be doing. That's that. All the rest of it is absolutely core, absolutely essential, and in truth is session prep if you want to view it in such a fashion, but it's certainly not what I would count as session prep.
Yeah. Seago asks, thinking about planning for an actual game session, what items do you bring? And Seago had like loads of examples.
For
like
example,
pens, pencils, books,
so plenty of, yeah. I am a minimalist when it comes to these things. I prefer not to eat when I'm playing. I will drink because my mouth dries out pretty quickly. And I'm diabetic on pills that mean that it makes me want to drink more. That's what one of my sets of pills do. So I always have juice on hand. I'm Scottish. I say juice for literally anything that's liquid that I can drink. It's a thing. So I will definitely have all of those. But beyond that, pens, paper, yeah, whatever, sure. I might have notes, but as I say, for my sessions, it's all in my head. I don't need them. I'll have my dice because I'm going to be using them for various random situations. Dice, for me, are a core component of role-playing because they stop me just making everything up, and I am happy doing that. But adding dice creates new stories that I don't expect, and I appreciate that because it adds randomity and unexpected situations, which actually create the core for me, what makes roleplay good. But beyond that, I leave it in the hands of other people. My prep is nothing more than providing a space that they can play in. And even then, it's often just a living room gathering around with friends when I'm doing it outside of a
Harder.
table. See you, Magnus.
Istian Lion Leon. What's your usual recommended method of updating Cubicle 7 stat list for your characters?
Estin, that is cruel. Okay, so I'm in a difficult position here because clearly I was a producer on Warhammer. And to take somebody else's work and to suggest that it is inefficient or doesn't do what needs to be done is really unfair and not nice on them. But I will say that if you look at, say, for example, the stats inside Warhammer Fantasy Roleplays The Enemy Within, the stats that are found in there are almost ridiculously low, like everybody's still a beginner and they haven't played through, say, 3 months, 6 months, a year's worth of role playing. It doesn't. A lot of the stats feel very, very low. So if I was going to answer this one, what's my usual method of scrapping their stats and just making my own? I know that's not that useful. So to answer this one a little bit more fully, then I'm almost certainly going to be doing at least over on Patreon a bunch of NPC stat builds, and through the process of doing that, I'll describe how I did it. And then once I've done that, I'll probably do a stream afterwards where I will go through the processes that I use to build experienced NPCs. Now, that's not to say that I'm going to say don't use C7's ones. If you want to use them, go for it. They are almost certainly perfect for your game if that's the case. But they're not good for my game. And my game just needs more. That being the case, I'm going to build a bunch and then tell everyone my process is so that you've got it. So I'll answer this one a little bitty later if that's okay.
If you wanted to do it really quickly, though, you could take the characters that are there and literally act just like up the talents, just up everything.
Yeah. It's not just up them. A lot of them are missing. I'll give a single example without going into any depth. If you've got an NPC who is a collector of art items, they need to have lore of the arts. Who's, an expert. If you don't, you dumb fucked up. That's number one. And if you got somebody who has no awareness of other characters, you don't give them a high initiative and a high intuition. You don't. So I'm actually going to argue to go down in some cases, not just up.
Yeah.
On the talent side, if you've got someone who is a noted expert in their field and has talents there, they're almost certainly going to have the talent at least 4 or 5 times. If they don't, again, you've messed up. They're nowhere near as good as they should be. And very generally, you can just add numbers on and not worry too much about the actual numbers. If they're experts, they've got like plus 30 in the skills, plus 35. If they're decent, they got about plus 20s. It's a good starting point, but I don't want to get too caught up on that.
Yeah. Aaron asked, do you have dreams about your campaigns or Warhammer since it's on your mind so much? Do you murmur skaven utterances in your sleep?
I don't remember my dreams anymore. So sadly, no. I really wish I did.
I would say I have Warhammer dreams once every 2 or 3 nights. I always remember my dreams, usually 2 or 3 of them a night, and the Warhammer dreams are about one every 2 or 3 nights. I'll dream, and I dream in character, like I am that person. So that's a thing. Last night's dream was about a greater demon of Zinch, so that was fun.
Doesn't sound good.
Right.
Are we done?
So I think we are done. Yeah. Thank you to everyone who
thank you everyone who joined us and watched all the way through. Surprising number of you made it all the way through to the end of the stream. I figured everyone would tail off about the hour mark. Turns out that wasn't the case. Thanks. If you'd like to say thanks in return, I think you all know what to do because I do bang this drum relatively frequently. But please do take a look at Dark Deeds. Please do go check down into the pre-order links, which you'll find inside the video description if you're watching on YouTube just now. And please do continue being awesome. We couldn't continue to do what we do without you turning up and watching our streams and in turn popping over and buying our games as we make them. Dark Deeds is a marvelous one and we've had an enormous amount of fun putting it together. Beyond that, thanks all. You are the best and we'll see you next time.
Thank you everyone. Thank you to all our patrons who keep this set of streams ad-free. Thank you to everyone who was watching tonight. It's episode 10. It's a mid-season break. We're having a couple of weeks off for weddings and various other things. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with a special Inside the Rookery with a local author. He's 13. He's
He's
written his own
13?
book about his own world that he's created, and I'm really excited to be interviewing him in a couple of weeks. So look out for that.
It's going to be
Speak
super
to you all
fun.
soon.
Can I also say, though, that during our little break, we're going to have a couple of masterclasses for the Brazen Rook
Yeah, we are.
patrons. So we're going to have 2 masterclasses going up during the course of our quick mid-season 2-week break. So there's still going to be stuff coming out, and it's going to be super fun.
We're already married. We are going to a medieval wedding at Duncarron Medieval Fort, and we could not be more excited about that. Watch out on social media streams for the medieval costumes that we have procured.
Good times.
Until then, no, goodbye. Speak to you all soon, and caw-caw, caw-caw, caw-caw.
Bye-bye.